So to start off, thank you all for joining us in the digital space to discuss informality and how development practitioners can leverage business environment reform to address informality-related challenges. Informality is prevalent in all economies, but there are particularly high levels of informality in developing economies. This limits government taxation and makes it difficult for public authorities to provide adequate government services. Informality also limits legal protections for workers and has an overall adverse effect on productivity and the prospects for economic growth. In an economy, there are many drivers of informality, and responses to this issue are varied and multifaceted. And our discussion will focus on some potential responses specifically founded in business environment reform. So today our discussion centers around a DCED publication titled Dealing with Informality, authored by Will Nielsen and Simon White. And we will hear more about this research from Will, and Judith Van Doorn from the International Labor Organization, and Cristian de la Medina Soto from the World Bank will present relevant case studies from Cape Verde and Ecuador, respectively. Will Nielsen and Simon White's paper reviews existing and emerging evidence on the informal economy and the tools that can be used to reduce vulnerabilities of informal firms and their workers while supporting the transition towards formality. The goal is to help government development agencies better understand the dynamic between business environment reform and enterprise formality, and inform development partners reform support programs. The subject is particularly relevant to crises like the COVID outbreak, which often give rise to questions about how to reach informal and less resilient economic operators. I don't want to give too much away ahead of Will's presentation, so without further delay, I'll hand it over to him to give us an overview of the paper. Will is an expert consultant to the World Bank Group with deep knowledge of diverse areas relevant to economic development, including informality, public-private trust, and public procurement. He has often led and or contributed to DCED research initiatives. And I don't know if it's possible, Jim, on your end for us to drop the link to the paper in the chat window, but that would be great. If not, I'll do it as soon as we get this conversation started. And I'll hand it over to Will now for his part of the presentation. Thank you all.
Great. Well, thanks, Musa. Appreciate that, and great to be connected with everyone here today. So yeah, as Musa said, I'll be presenting the high-level takeaways, findings from the report that I co-authored with Simon White, dealing with firm informality. And as Musa mentioned, this report covers a broad swath of literature. We start with outlining definitions around the concept of informality itself. We break out how that the informality can look different in different contexts, what that may mean by region, types of individuals who may be more or less likely to appear within the informal economy, how the economy may differ based on how we're looking at informal firms versus informal workers. And so there's several aspects in terms of discussing the heterogeneity of the informality as a concept that we delve into. But from there, then we move into this discussion around the various business environment reforms that have been studied within that context of the informal economy and how they may be effective or in some cases less effective in driving increased rates of formalization. So I'll start here with our first set of key learnings. Musa mentioned that the informal economy in many cases, especially in many developing economies, it may be more prevalent than the formal economy is. And so it is often quite large. In many cases, you'll see stats such as 25 to 40% of an economy's GDP may be in the informal economy. That may include upwards of 60% of all workers being based in the informal economy. And it's, depending on the region and sector, that figure may move up towards 90% of workers being informal workers, especially in cases such as rural agricultural regions in some areas in sub-Saharan Africa. So the next set of key learnings here that we hit on is with regard to the extent that business environment reform can address informality in its own right. And so within the report, we move through the best available evidence to date to look at what are the signals that we have around the different interventions that have been put into place, as well as the reforms implemented more generally. And in many cases, reforms have mixed results. There are certainly some positive signals out there. We see, for example, on the list at the bottom of the slide, you see here outlines some of those areas of business environment reform that have shown to have positive impacts in terms of increasing the rates of informalization, especially aspects such as that legal and regulatory reform. We see various research around business entry interventions and reforms that have been put into place, these being interventions such as ways to incentivize registration, incentivize the acquiring the appropriate licenses. And it may also be things like our more traditional business entry reforms, such as just reducing the complexity of acquiring that license in the first place, reducing the time involved, the costs required, etc. From there, then the next few categories of reforms then look at that fiscal reform, as well as aspects of financial reform and labor reform. And we provide any details within the report as well, outlining the types of impacts those can have. Especially with regard to the fiscal reform, I think you see many aspects tied to simplifying tax structures, reducing tax burdens in many cases for those firms that move towards formalization. So in this next slide here, this key learnings, we look at, oh, sorry, Jim, we can go back to that previous one. This slide here, we look at, and this became a large focus of the paper, where in addition to outlining the I'll say more traditional areas that fall within the business environment reform that are linked to informality and the extent that those reforms can support increased rates of formalization, we then add in this large secondary body of research really to broaden the net of our understanding around all the different potential tools that donors, policymakers, development agencies may have at their disposal to support business environment reform. And part of the reasoning for using this broader net is this recognition that in many cases, business environment alone, while it is often or is strongly associated with rates of formality within the economy, in its own is not necessarily the sole driver of becoming formal. And so that led us to expanding that lens here and taking the stock taking rather of these various other tools that may be in play. And so we broke these into two categories. The first being number one there on the screen, measures that complement business environment reform. So in many cases, these are tools or initiatives, strategies that would be implemented alongside a business environment reform. So some of the examples that we dig into within the report are the first being this discussion around behavioral science and how there are different tools within the behavioral science space that support both diagnosis, so understanding why workers or firms may not be going formal as much as one would hope. In many cases, we see that there are various factors that come into play that drive an individual's decision to pursue formality, and in some cases, it may be things like social norms or traditional ways of doing business. It may also be things like pre-existing discriminatory practices that may occur. Especially we dig into some of the barriers that women face, and as a result are often overrepresented within the most vulnerable positions within the informal economy. So there's an assortment of tools that we outline and potential opportunities for the leveraging of behavioral insights to help deliver business environment reforms as effectively as possible and really support their uptake to the maximum extent. The next one there is this broad category, digital technologies, where we've seen there are many opportunities for linking digital technologies to business environment reforms that support informal workers and informal firms, as well as these tools are often, and we've seen, I'm sure many of you have seen various examples come out over the past few years where these tools are often reaching informal workers and informal firms via especially financial tools, fintech tools. We see a lot of development around as they're providing access to finance and access to credit to those that are otherwise unbanked or underbanked. And as well as providing various other services. It may be things like market information, just increased access to information that helps firms make better decisions and realize the potential benefits that may come from formalization. And with that then is that next bullet regarding building trust, where, and as I mentioned, there are in some cases, traditional ways of operating that may mean that formalization isn't necessarily considered to the extent that one might otherwise. And in some cases that may be due to things like low tax morale or high levels of perceived corruption within the public sector that may lead private firms, informal firms, to have less interest generally in pursuing formalization. In many cases, we see things like perceived corruption be one of the leading indicators of the extent a firm wants or is interested in becoming formal. And so we outline within the report a few strong case studies. This is an area where we expect further research to develop, but the concept of trust does underpin many of the relationship between public and private sectors, and that being a strong building block for pursuing formalization as well too. One of the examples that I'll highlight briefly is just participatory decision making. We've seen have a strong effect on tax compliance in particular, as this increased understanding of how government budgets are being spent and where they should go, and being able to help guide where they go is a strong way to support engagement in some cases. The next number 2 there, we outline a series of other instruments that can be put in play along with business environment reform. In many cases, these are tools that may not necessarily have a goal of formalization explicitly, but they may indirectly support increased rates of formalization due to the extent that they support similar objectives. So in many cases, if we're driving towards increasing rates of formalization, we are also thinking about, we want reduced vulnerabilities, we want to support increased productivity, supporting increased tax revenue, many of these other co-objectives that also exist alongside increased rates of formalization. And so some of those tools that are in play within this space include aspects of social protection. So this may be designing or expanding on existing social protection programs that help reduce the vulnerabilities and reduce the perceived risk for informal workers or small informal firms who otherwise have less perceived opportunity, maybe heightened risk that reduces innovation, which we note then as that second bullet there, where while we do see strong cases for innovation coming from the informal sector due to this often more constrained operating environment that those informal firms or workers may have, in some cases, being in the informal economy with these increased vulnerabilities may have place a downward pressure on rates of innovation, as well as perceived risk is high, and making additional expenditures for something that you don't know is going to pay off may not feel like a rational economic decision. The next bullet there then highlights human capital development. This is with regard to things like managerial trainings and assortment of educational opportunities that may be supported or delivered for informal firms, entrepreneurs, informal workers, as in many cases, the education level and the managerial experience of the entrepreneur is often a strong indicator of the likelihood that that firm will be formal or be formalized. And so orienting activities and supporting resources to grow that human capital development has been pointed to as an important component as well. The next then being this element of business capacity building, where there are an assortment of opportunities that are outlined. These can be in addition to or in tandem with some of the human capital development examples I just outlined, but they may also take a broader view and consider some of the existing networks that may be in place that informal firms and workers may be a part of. This can include things like the social and solidarity economy, where we see structures such as cooperatives allow for the pooling of resources and the pooling of risk in many cases as well too, which can also then serve to help provide a voice to government officials, can provide a means of accessing social protections that individually might otherwise be able to access. And along those lines too, other aspects of kind of formal agglomeration or working along lines of industry clusters has been shown to have many of those same benefits that we would expect from formalization without necessarily achieving formal status itself. And so when I mention that, that's just outcomes like increased incomes for those operating in clusters, increased productivity for firms that may be operating in industry clusters. And so acknowledging the opportunity of leveraging those clusters or cooperatives or associations, various means of organizing businesses, whether they're a formal or informal arrangement, can be a means of supporting that next step towards formalization as well. And then the last one we note there is just the types of additional support that have come during the pandemic, with two main means of support being provided. There's the form of more immediate assistance. This can often be things like the cash transfers to individuals or to firms to help mitigate the downside risk of more immediate and sizable risks, such as especially tied to things like the shutdowns, where business opportunities may evaporate quite rapidly. And then on the other side of that coin then is with regard to things like supporting this human capital development or the business capacity building that we just mentioned as well, where the pandemic has helped identify where there are some of these significant gaps. And through the use of some digital technologies, for example, there are ways to help facilitate that rapid reskilling or redirecting to new economic opportunities that otherwise might have been harder to facilitate. So in some cases, some of these tools are the types of tools that we envision being continued post-pandemic as well, but the pandemic brought a spotlight to the needs for them in some cases. And we can jump to the next slide. So I know we've outlined a series of things rather quickly here, and certainly happy to field other questions regarding what all is included in that report. But based on that lit review that we conducted and the various research done, we outline a series of these key learnings and recommendations that for donors and development agencies are those types of things that are what we would consider key considerations as you're looking at ways for engaging the informal economy and supporting transition to formalization. So the first being that this focus on business environment reform for firm formalization is important. This means building reform packages that are comprehensive rather than one-off reforms, as well as taking into account the wide heterogeneity that the informal sector may take and understanding who may be impacted by a given reform, as well as then bringing a gender lens to all business environment reform being considered, as we've seen that gender neutral policy alone is likely not enough to overcome some of the built-in barriers that many women face in realizing the potential of going formal. Next then is this acknowledgement of leveraging complementary programs when developing business environment reform. So we outlined things like looking for opportunities to use digital tools where feasible and appropriate, taking into account rates of smartphone penetration in an economy, the extent that maybe SMS messaging may be more appropriate, the rates of cell service and internet accessibility. Those are factors for consideration, as well as then looking at means for supporting increased trust and leveraging these behavioral insights as appropriate as well to inform more effective reform delivery. Number 3 there, we then highlight again some of these reforms that are necessary for the informal economy, not only for supporting increased rates of formalization, but also for generally reducing the vulnerability of those in the informal economy as a whole. So this being those tools like social protection, innovative financial products, looking at ways for working with the social and solidarity economy to improve conditions, and again, considering other digital solutions that may be appropriate. The last point then is, again, acknowledging that there will continue to be, I expect, while we hope to be out of some of the worst of the variants, and I think, many recognize that that risk is still here, and the aftershocks of some of the pandemic effects will likely continue for some time. And so considering what types of financial investments and human capital investments that may be supported by donors and development agencies will continue to be important for supporting that resiliency going forward. And so with that, I'll conclude here on that wrap up for our report, but look forward to hearing any questions that come up at the end here.
Thanks so much, Will, for that great overview. I particularly appreciate, this acknowledgement that business environment reform on its own is not the sole driver of formality, and that you've highlighted some of these measures that can complement business environment reform, and also talked about some intermediary interventions or steps that reduce the vulnerability of workers and less resilient communities without specifically aiming to yield firm formalization in the immediate term. So thank you for that overview. I'm sure we'll have questions for you towards the end, but as I said before, we'll let all of the presenters go ahead, and then we'll come back for the round of questions at the top of the hour. So now we'll turn to the case studies, starting with Judith Van Doren's case on supporting women entrepreneurs in Cape Verde. Judith is a specialist on enterprise formalization at the ILO in Switzerland. She has worked for 25 years in the areas of sustainable enterprise development, social finance, and formalization. And her experience on enterprise formalization spans multiple regions, including Latin America and the Caribbean and Sub-Saharan Africa. Judith, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Musa. So I want to present to you the introduction of a special regime for micro and small enterprises in Cabo Verde, and how this relates to sustainable enterprise development and decent work. So on the next slide, you can see the country that we're talking about, Cabo Verde, is just off the coast by West Africa. It consists of 10 islands, and as you can see, the population is quite small, and economically active population is a bit over 200,000 people. And if we move to the next slide, you can see that in 2015, an informal sector survey was conducted, and 3 out of 4 enterprises were not willing to pay taxes, and 3 out of 5 enterprises were not willing to formalize. So you can see there was quite a negative attitude towards operating in the formal economy. Now, if we move to the next slide, you can see that in 2011, we supported the government to conduct a study for the creation of a simplified legal regime for micro and small enterprises called REMPE. And this regime was created in 2014. And it aims to make it easier and more attractive for micro and small enterprises to register, and thereby also then get support and get access to services to become more competitive. Now, this regime is open to micro and small enterprises with a share capital of less than $100,000 and with up to 10 workers. And then on the next slide, you can see the benefits. So when you register under this regime, your registration is simplified. So you can register under a one-stop shop, and the accounting requirements are lighter than for other types of enterprises. The enterprises under this regime, they pay a special unified tax, which is 4% of the turnover. And this unified tax, it actually replaces some of the taxes that you can see on this slide. And it also contains a component of social security contributions that are usually made by the employers. So this, what we sometimes call monotributo, it combines both a tax and a social security component. The enterprises in this regime also have some tax benefits, for example, temporary reductions, or they are exempt from the payment of the special unified tax, and they get access to social security benefits, which both applies for the employers, the entrepreneur, but also for the workers in those businesses. And the formalized enterprises can get access to trainings, partnership opportunities, and subsidized credit lines and government subsidies. So you can see that the benefits of formalizing are both financial and non-financial in terms of business opportunities. And by getting access to social security, this is not only attractive for the entrepreneur, but also for the workers. In return, the business owner needs to submit quarterly payments of this special unified tax, and they need to maintain records on the purchases and the sales over a period of 8 years. They need to have a bank account through which all payments and receipts can be tracked. And they need to register workers with the Social Security Institute. If we move ahead, we can see an assessment that we have done with the government of Cabo Verde to look at the achievements of the REMPE. And overall, we found that the REMPE has been well designed and it encourages formalization. Now, before looking at these figures, I want to share with you some information on the size of informality in Cabo Verde so that we can put these things in perspective. So there are roughly 33,000 informal economic units in Cabo Verde, and the REMPE by 2018 had a bit more than 10,000 enterprises registered. So I think, comparing these figures, you can see that this is quite a considerable number. Also, we have seen an increase in the number of people that have registered under Social Security. And there has been an increase of more than 21,000 people, of which half is due to the REMPE regime. So again, you can see the REMPE has not only led to the formalization of the businesses, gaining new business opportunities in the formal economy, but also benefiting workers and entrepreneurs through access to Social Security, because you can only get this if you register under the REMPE. We found that there is still some room for improvement, with respect to certification and supervision of enterprises. And it is important to still simplify the tax procedures and align the tax burden to the nature of the small enterprises so that they're actually able to make the payments at the time needed. And also it is important to clarify the procedures and to create a platform so that the relevant entities that engage in the REMPE can align their work. So you can think of the business registry, the tax office, but also the SME promotion agency. And having put the REMPE in place doesn't mean that people know about it and will register. So it's important to increase more awareness of the regime and the benefits that are attached to it. And lastly, we found that it's important to provide additional support to develop the formalized enterprises. So then we move to the next slide. You can see here a pilot that we launched with the government at the beginning of the pandemic. In October 2020, we actually launched a pilot called Sucupira in Praia, which is the capital of Cabo Verde. And there is a big informal market where many entrepreneurs, many women entrepreneurs are engaging. And this was launched not only during the pandemic, but also after there have been some floods in Cabo Verde. Now, the goal of this pilot project was to support these women-owned informal enterprises to strengthen their business capacities, but also to get access to finance and to support them to formalize if this is useful for them. And this pilot was implemented with the national partner agency called Pro Empresa, which is the Micro and Small Enterprise Development Agency. On the left, you can see the sectors in which these women entrepreneurs were operating. And because of the floods and because of the pandemic, some of them had lost their produce, some of them had lost their stocks, and many of them had lost clients. So they really needed support, including access to finance, to overcome this crisis. So if we move on to the next slide, you can see what the pilot consists of. So there were different components in the pilot. First of all, the entrepreneurs got business development training and financial education to learn how to manage their money. And they were also sensitized on the importance to formalize and the benefits that they could gain from formalizing. The SME agency opened a desk in this informal market through which these entrepreneurs could get information and they could register under the REMPE regime. And if they then formalized, they would get access to this subsidized credit line by the government, which was backed up by a guarantee. Now we saw that this pilot project actually reached more people than the 50 that we targeted. We saw that 2,000 entrepreneurs had visited this information desk, and within a period of about half a year, 900 enterprises have formalized, and this pilot project is being replicated by the government in other markets. If we move on to the next slide, you can see the partners and how they work together. So this information desk in the market by the SME agency is there as a first go-to place for these informal women entrepreneurs. So they can get some information about what it means to register, they can get some training, and they can submit their applications to formalize. The agency then works together with the Social Security Institute and the tax office, which will assess eligibility and which will also provide the benefits to the registered entrepreneurs. They in turn work together with the SME agency and the guarantee provider to assess loan applications and eligibility for the loan and for the guarantee. These agencies work with microfinance institutions and banks because they handle the loan distribution, and they are also close to the women entrepreneurs, so they are more used to engage with this audience. And when people have obtained the loans and they've registered, they can get technical assistance to develop and grow their business. So if we move ahead to the next slide, I want to wrap up by sharing with you some testimonies from these women entrepreneurs who have registered under the simplified regime and who have gotten support through the pilot project. You can see that they have mentioned that access to finance was very useful for them. They were able to buy new products that they could sell in the market. One woman told us that before she registered and before she got the financial education training, the banks would refuse her requests, but now she's better able to negotiate with the banks and to manage her debt and organize her business and her finances. And lastly, one woman told us that she now has access to Social Security. She has benefits such as medicine at low cost. She's protected when she gets sick, and she makes payments so that she has a pension when she retires. We have documented these testimonies and our approach, and we'll paste a link to some videos in the chat box. And with that, we can move on to the next slide. I would like to thank you, and I'm available to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Judith. Great presentation and very complimentary to some of what we'll cover. I think the numbers speak for themselves just when you look at the jump that you all experienced with Rempe from 2015 to 2018. And also, you know, the Sucupira pilot that you talked about touches on many of the complementary types of interventions that Will was mentioning. I particularly like that, you know, you in kind of developing the pilot, you convened all these various partners involved and involved them in the process. And also that it seems to me from the pie chart that we saw earlier that the model is quite sector agnostic, when we see often that, you know, these types of interventions to simplify regimes can focus on specific sectors, but it seems like this model brought together all these various sectors and simplified registration for them all. So thank you for that, Judith, and for the relevant example again. We'll now turn over to our second case study, an example on Ecuador, which will be presented by Cristian de la Medina Soto. A lawyer by profession, Christian is an expert on regulatory reform and private sector development from the World Bank Group. He brings a rich knowledge and experience on investment climate issues to the discussion on enterprise formality. So without delaying further, Christian, I'll turn over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Musa. Hello, everyone. So thank you for the invite to the webinar. As Musa was mentioning, my name is Cristian de la Medina Soto. And for me, it's a pleasure to be with all of you today, sharing an interesting business environment reform case study from Ecuador, where we work closely with the government to introduce a new simplified company type in the legal framework of the country to encourage business creation, especially for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, as well as formalization of existing companies. If we can go to the first slide, before I want to go into detail on how the reform was introduced in Ecuador and its impact in the economy, it is important to establish why the introduction of a simplified corporation form helps addressing informality. As we all know, informality is a long-standing phenomenon worldwide, and especially in most developing countries like Ecuador, it is far bigger than the formal economy and has further grown during the pandemic, pushing many companies into the informal sector. So one of the questions that many scholars in this topic ask themselves is what it can be done to move informal enterprises into the formal sector and what advantages exist to incentivize the formalization of companies. So currently, one of the problems is that the majority of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in developing countries still exist in the informal sector despite needing formal legal status to operate and enter into contracts. And in consequence, the informal sector employs a very high percentage of the labor force in those countries, preventing employees to access to social security protection and leaving them at a higher risk of losing their jobs, and nowadays even more during the pandemic. This was also a reality in Ecuador. Another important reason that impedes business formalization is that micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises often face legal barriers to prevent their formal establishment, their growth, and ability to do business. And why is this? Well, traditional business models are generally unsuitable for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises because of different reasons, such as high incorporation cost. The time to set up a company in many cases is very lengthy. Incorporation processes cannot be completed without using services of third parties, such as notary publics or lawyers. Also, there's multiple member ownership or inefficient enforcement mechanisms, among other reasons. So in response to those issues, the international community explored different ideas on how to move informal MSMEs into the formal sector, and one of them is through the introduction of a new simplified corporation form, which is a simple and easy alternative form that reduces complexity and hence also the cost and potential barriers to entries, and offers flexibility in its operation and structure. In addition, it is important to understand what the advantages are of moving informal MSMEs into the formal sector for businesses and for governments. For example, for businesses, some of the advantages are providing companies with better access to credit and possibility to grow, better access to government services, access to markets, and the possibility to provide their employees with social security protection through labor formalization. In addition, the advantages to the overall economy could be tracked through higher tax revenues and social security contributions and reduction of unemployment rates. So due to these advantages and factors, in recent years, many countries in the world, including Ecuador, have been implementing legal reforms to simplify or improve the process of starting and operating a business through adopting a new corporation type, the so-called Simplified Corporation form, also named S.A.S, which main objectives we can see in this slide are to provide an alternative corporate form suitable for family-owned firms, startups, and all sorts of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And also another objective is that serves an important function in encouraging formalization of existing businesses and provide flexibility while operating them. So in the next slide, and to better understand this new simplified corporation form, a set of 12 elements has been identified as key by various organizations such as the World Bank, the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and the Organization of American States as global best practices considered essential for simplifying incorporation and operation of companies. In the slide, we can see the 12 key elements of this company type, and we can highlight some of them. For example, the concept of legal personality, by which the entity that is created is a separate legal entity from the person or persons who create, own, and operate that entity. The full-fledged limited liability element, which is also closely connected with the legal personality concept, because shareholders are limited in liability to the extent of their capital contributions. Also, the possibility of single shareholder, which enables businesses operated by one person to become an incorporated entity and enjoy the benefits of incorporation, and the maximum freedom of contract, which includes flexible internal structure and recognition of shareholder agreement. All these 12 elements make business incorporation less costly and more accessible, particularly for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and also allows companies to operate more easily. In our next slide, we are showing who can incorporate the simplified corporation form. This corporation form, as we mentioned briefly, so it's ideal for family-owned companies and startups, and also micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And it can be incorporated by nationals or foreigners, individuals or corporation, and any type of company of any type, of any size. In the next slide, we can see briefly the list of countries that have fully adopted or are planning to adopt the Simplified Corporation form. For instance, the first country in the world that adopted this Simplified Corporation form was in Europe, and it was France. Then also we can see in the world other countries that also are fully adopting or planning to adopt this company type, such as United States, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, and Ecuador, while in other countries like Indonesia or Brazil and El Salvador are in the process or considering adopting this form either through legal reform of existing laws or the introduction of new legislation. Now, the interesting part of this presentation is going to come in the next slide. And now, specifically, talking about the case study of Ecuador and how they address informality through implementing a simplified legal form that lower the burden of formalization and provide them with benefits for their operation, it is important to point out some of the milestones that the government took to implement this simplified legal form and track successfully its impact. So first, since 2019, the government of Ecuador started addressing the big issue that thousands of micro and small businesses in the country were operating in the informal sector, and the number of new businesses were in decline in the last years. In consequence, they started exploring ideas to move those companies to the formal sector and to incentivize business creation. As part of these efforts, the government of Ecuador implemented a legal reform that could help change this reality, thanks to a new simplified, cost-free type of company that allows a single individual to start a business with maximum contractual flexibility, known as the Simplified Corporation form. The government introduced this company type through the Organic Law of Entrepreneurs in February of 2020, and also developed a specific regulation to explain further the specificities and procedure of this company type. In parallel, the government also developed several initiatives to inform the private sector of this reform and to collect data from the users to improve their processes. For example, they developed performance measurement reports, also created a satisfaction survey for the private sector, user guidelines, online training courses, and also conducted an extensive communication campaign to raise awareness of the reform and also to incentivize the use of this company type. Then in the next slide, we can see that after the implementation of the S.A.S law, Ecuador experienced exponential growth in the number of newly founded S.A.S companies in comparison of newly founded companies in other categories, and the trend has continued to date. We can see that in this graph that we are making a comparison with the corporation, the Société Anonyme, the limited liability company, and the association or consortium, and we can see this trend that continues to date. And you can see in the last part that, of course, like now the Simplified Corporation form has become the most popular vehicle, corporate vehicle to start and operate a business in the country. Then in the next slide, we can see that Ecuador was facing a steady decline in business creation during the first months of 2020, but then started having a rapid increase after May 18, 2020, which marks the day when the first S.A.S was created officially. Confidently, we can state that the Simplified Corporation form in Ecuador helped to drive economic recovery in Ecuador through the creation of businesses, even during the pandemic. Through different feedback loops implemented by the Superintendency of Companies, we were also able to verify that Ecuadorian business people view the simplified corporate type as an opportunity to start new businesses and operate them in a flexible way, avoiding cumbersome and expensive bureaucratic procedures. Also, during these months, the private sector also benefited from the introduction of an electronic system created especially for this simplified corporation type, which facilitate the creation and operation of new companies from the comfort and safety of the Ecuadorian homes. And finally, in the next slide, we can see some key aspects about the impact of this simplified corporation form in Ecuador. For example, after almost 2 years of the implementation of the first simplified corporation form in the country, 61.4% of the total companies has been created under this company type, becoming the most popular corporate vehicle in the country. Also notably, around 3,900 women have managed to create and formalize their businesses through this new company type, and 30% of the total number of this simplified corporation form has selected women as their legal representative in charge of managing the affairs of the corporation. Another interesting fact is that 50.5% of the total number of S.A.S created were registered by a single shareholder, and the sectors that have benefited the most through this company type are the wholesale and retail trade sector, professional services, scientific and technical activities, and the construction sector. Then also the S.A.S has also permitted local and national governments to collect thousands of dollars in taxes and in social security contributions. And the government of Ecuador has seen a significant increase in the creation of new jobs after the implementation of this corporate type. In conclusion, the simplified corporation form may be beneficial in other countries in the world if appropriately adopted. It will be particularly useful in developing and emerging economies where there is an increased need for flexibility and new user-friendly corporate vehicles, not just for incorporation, but also during the operation of the company. So thank you very much. Over to you, Musa. Also, in case of any doubts, I will be delighted to answer to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. I think it's really great that you kind of covered this legal form in Ecuador and talked about, the specific focus on not just traditionally, small, medium, or large firms, but also focusing on micro firms, because as we all know, often a lot of these businesses are at the household level. And I think it's really impressive that, within 2 years alone, 61% of companies that were created were specifically created under this type. And the evidence is there to show that this is something that helped facilitate some of the economic recovery in Ecuador, and that's specifically because in the midst of a crisis, these economic operators need some level of flexibility, and it's just it's a great success to also see that this has led to job creation. So thank you for those insights and that input. Great presentation from all 3 of our presenters. Thank you so much, Will, for setting the stage for us to also hear about the case studies that followed on from Judith and also from Christian. I'd like to open it up now for questions and comments for our moderated discussion. I want to remind everyone to please use the Q&A function and the chat feature, and or raise your hand if you'd like to come off mute and ask your questions or make a comment. So I'm just going to check here and see if we have any incoming questions, or if we have, I obviously have some questions of my own, but I want to give an opportunity to the audience first to ask their questions. Well, then I guess I'll get started with some of my questions, and we can obviously circle back to the questions from the audience. I guess I'll start off with a question for Will. Just with regard to the presentation that you gave, how should we consider the difference between starting formal and transitioning to formal? How does that, impact the approach that we use?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Musa. Yeah, I think that aspect is really interesting and something that we came across within our our research for this report was just how much, in many cases, there is that important distinction between starting formal versus transitioning to formal after having operated informally for a period of time. There are multiple sources out there that note that in many cases, it's a relatively small percent of firms that were informal at the start and became formal. So that's just to say that in many cases, facilitating the transition away from a new way of doing business can be difficult at times. And so in some cases, having the available resources and just like the case studies that Judith and Christiane mentioned, these other tools that are in place make that first leap into entrepreneurship much easier, and it makes it much easier to start formal right from the get-go, rather than operating, building your network, supply chains, etc., however you're operating, and then making this transition, which may involve changing the way you're operating in some cases. So I think we note that just as a consideration to have in the back of your mind as you're thinking about who you're reaching with the reforms and tools that are potentially being implemented.
Thank you so much, Will. I don't know if Judith or Christian have any views on that question as well. I also have some questions for you, but I wanted to check if you wanted to speak to that question.
Not for now, thanks.
Perfect.
Same.
So I do have one question that I think applies to both Judith and Christian's presentations, and it's mainly about to what extent you can speak to how much the models that have been developed by the in collaboration with the ILO in Cabo Verde, and also in collaboration with the World Bank in Ecuador, how you think those models can be replicated elsewhere. Do you have any evidence, or have you started working on replicating this model elsewhere already? What can you say, or how can you speak to that specifically? Thank you.
Okay, I guess you mentioned my name first, so I'll go first, right? Yeah, I think what we need in such a situation is to have a strong commitment from the government and a real willingness for them to actually understand the issue and deal with the issue. And that also relates to a question in the chat box about sustainability of the REMPE. Actually, the REMPE, it's a simplified regime that was introduced by the government. So this was not done by the ILO, only that we supported the process with the studies and also additional studies to improve it. What we did was the pilot project, which has this complementary support for people to formalize and then develop their business. So a strong buy-in from the government, and also a willingness to coordinate across different ministries. So if you could see, there's a component on registration, there's a component on taxes, there's a component on finance, and a component on social security. So it means that different entities need to combine and align and make sure that what they do complements each other and doesn't contradict. Because sometimes you could see, you could fall between the cracks because the initiatives are not building on each other. There needs to be, I think, a willingness to also dig into these incentives. And often people say we have incentives, but what they mean is tax benefits. So when you're informal and then you formalize, maybe you pay less taxes than in the past, but you're still going to pay more taxes than if you remain informal. So I'm really advocating all the time for solid, strong incentives that are really appealing for entrepreneurs. Some of these can be driven by the government, like in the example we've seen, the government came in with a credit line which was subsidized, they have access to social security, there are some partnership opportunities, etc. But some of these incentives, they are always there in the private sector. So for example, a commercial bank will want you to be registered before they will give you a loan. So that's already something you can work with. selling to larger enterprises in the formal economy will require you to be registered. So there are some of these incentives that you can work with, but I think if you really want to make a dent in informality, you need to, as a government, look at what you can do to make it more attractive for enterprises to formalize and to develop and grow. And this means that you will need to have some strong institutions, like, you know, the example on access to finance and the example on social security. It will only work if you have good systems and good social security institutes where people have confidence that when they make a payment, they will get something in return. And then the nature of the enterprise segment also has an impact. So some countries have a lot more informality, and others it's much smaller. So you will also need to look into this. So these are a few of the main takeaways that I would like to share. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Judith. I particularly appreciate what you just said there about, you know, the institutions. It's not a foregone conclusion that just because you simplify the regime that, you know, you kind of will have an uptake in registrations. The institutions need to work effectively in the background as well to essentially have the trust that's needed for that uptake to happen. So thank you for that. Christian, I'm wondering if you can also speak to that question. You know, again, the question is just to what extent the approach can be replicated elsewhere. So basically what you've done in Ecuador, or what the World Bank has helped facilitate in Ecuador, how that might be replicated elsewhere, if the World Bank is potentially already working in other countries to try to replicate this effort.
Thank you for the question. And actually, we have been working closely with different governments. Right now, I can tell you that we have been replicating the same Simplified Corporation form in other countries such as Uruguay, Paraguay, and most recently in El Salvador, we are working with the government to introduce this company type into their legal framework. However, as Judith was mentioning, what is important to understand is that this is a legal reform, right? So we need the strong commitment from the government, right? And the buy-in from all the stakeholders, because you can only do this introduction of this company type through adopting this form either through reforms of existing laws or the introduction of new legislation. So in that case, so you need this strong commitment from the governments, but in our experience, so right now there's this trend, at least right now in Latin America, and based on very successful stories, such as the one in Ecuador and also the one in Colombia, that right now in Colombia, as to put this in context, this Simplified Corporation form represents 98% of the total number of companies that are created in the country. So when you go and then you are explaining like this, the advantages of this new Simplified Corporation form that is very attractive to all type of businesses, not just micro, small, and medium size, but of course is targeting those. So it's important, the governments could be convinced when they see these very interesting and attractive examples from other peers. So yeah, so right now we can replicate in any other regions as well. So it's just a matter that governments show interest and commitment to do these legal reforms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. And I just wanted to say also thank you to Kristen for the question in the Q&A function. And just to let Judith know, Kristen acknowledges the answer. So thank you for that. Well, back to you if you don't mind. This is another question for you. What is the role of cooperatives and associations and industry clusters in supporting informal enterprises and also supporting the transition to formality?
Yeah, no, a really interesting topic, and one we dug into a little extra within the report itself, where there were a series of strong case studies around the benefits that can come from being a part of a cooperative as an informal entrepreneur or informal firm. things like being able to access resources that might otherwise be difficult to access on their own came through as being really important, as well as things like being a part of business associations. Some business associations are composed largely of informal firms or informal workers, and the ability to organize as that association can often be a really powerful means of facilitating communication with officials and becoming a really important part of discussion around what a comprehensive set of reforms or appropriate set of reforms might be. And so in that way, the informal firms themselves become drivers of what the end reform ends up looking like and supporting their ability to go formal. And this is, I think, in largely impactful in that the firms themselves are looking at the benefits of formalization, not just the goal of being formal. It's formalization is a means to another end. And so as much as reforms can have that in mind, and the entrepreneurs definitely have that in mind, that this is a way to get to that growth, that productivity, hiring employees, et cetera. So having that in mind and having that voice of the actual firms and workers a part of the discussion is a way that some of these cooperatives and associations have been able to really leverage their numbers, I'll say, to help facilitate that. And similarly, on the clusters side of things, while they may not always have the level of organization that comes with a business association or a cooperative, in many cases, they are still sources of higher productivity, in that we see informal firms operating in clusters tending to have higher rates of productivity than those doing similar activities but outside of the cluster. So there's some synergies that come from operating within that space. And so we see that as in terms of acknowledging that those are some of the very outcomes that a firm may pursue as a result, or in pursuing formalization, some of the same types of outcomes that they may have from being a part of a cluster may be what they get from being formal as well too. And so pairing those two together to help those meet those larger outcomes again of the productivity, wage growth are another means for supporting that formalization goal as a whole.
Thank you so much, Will. We have a couple questions that have come in, and I'll read the first one here from Karim Bayo. For the Ecuadorian case study on the simplified registration form, are there experiences on how informal entrepreneurs who are not used to complete administrative processes perceive the simplified form? How are they incentivized to use it and register their entrepreneurial activity? So, Christian, I think that's a question that's more, directed at you, if you wouldn't mind answering that one.
Yes, well, so we didn't have a specific, when we were designing this project. So first was the legal reform, and then we start tracking the impact that it has in the economy, but we didn't have the possibility to talk specifically to the private sector, to the people that were in the informal sector at that time, and what were the drivers specifically to become or to move to the formal sector. However, as we were mentioning before, so we have all these, I don't know, there's a lot of studies about like these key elements that help and make it easier for business people to make this decision, and highlighting all the advantages probably also was some of the considerations that they took into account to transition from the informal to the formal sector. Also, something that is important is that the introduction of the Simplified Corporation form in Ecuador was at the beginning of the pandemic, where you can see that many companies also moved from the formal to the informal sector right away. And in some cases, so some of the companies, so some of the so they wanted to become part of the formal sector because of some of the incentives that the government was providing to them, but only to the formal sector, right? So if you are in the informal sector and the government was trying to provide certain incentives for companies during these first months of the pandemic, so they were not going to be able to access to all of those. So probably also was another reason of why some of the companies were also at the beginning trying to move to the formal sector as well. But I guess that what we were mentioning in the presentation, so the possibility of not using intermediaries to create a company, the possibility to have a single shareholder, and also all the flexibility that you have when you in your internal structure of the company, those were also very attractive to all type of companies. And we see that also other companies, existing companies, also saw this specific company type as more attractive for them because of this flexibility, and that's why they also transform from other company types into this simplified corporation. I don't know if I was able to answer the question, but if they have a follow-up question, so please let me know.
Thank you so much, Christian. Karim can definitely let us know if that answers the question, and you have the response there already. Thank you, Karim. And with just a few minutes left, I have one last question directed at Judith and Christian, and this links really to the concept of, the simplified form and how it sometimes removes intermediaries in the process to simplify, registration or any kind of regulatory compliance. So this comes from Tanya. To what extent has there been pushback on such reforms from parties with vested interests, for example, notaries, bar associations, etc., especially if the law waives the mandatory use of such intermediaries? And how was the pushback handled? So there you go. I don't know if you have any specific examples, Judith or Christian, of how, third parties that were removed from the process reacted.
Yeah, I don't have any information on this from Cabo Verde. I think it depends a lot also on the nature of the economy. So I think in Cabo Verde, as you saw with the figures, many people would fall in this regime. And maybe as a side note, maybe even some notaries would be able to benefit from the regime. So I'll stop here.
In the case of the Simplified Corporation form, so this is one of the criticisms that the Simplified Corporation form has received in different countries. And of course, there has been some pushback from these stakeholders. Of course, notary publics are affected, or they think that they are affected because nowadays with this Simplified Corporation form, you are able to create the company without the use of intermediaries and also with a private contract. However, so the approach that we are taking to this Simplified Corporation form is that this is just an alternative to the traditional corporate model, and we are letting businesses decide for themselves which avenue they will like. So what other people, what they are still doing in many of the countries is that they are still continue to use the services of a notary public or a lawyer because of also continued distrust of non-formalized documents by others that the business will encounter, for example, in the financial sector. And for similar reasons, also some of the companies are still using internal audit provisions, which are not mandatory for this Simplified Corporation form. So in order to overcome this challenge, governments, like what they have been doing, is strengthen areas such as the financial oversight and taxation control mechanisms. And in addition, the countries will need to, of course, promote and have more an extensive outreach campaign and capacity building program to raise awareness and achieve buy-in from all the stakeholders, and to ensure, for example, these intermediaries, the notary publics, that in many cases, they will still be part, or they will still, it's not that they are like losing their jobs by not having the creation of this company type through a through the notary public. It's just kind of another alternative that the government is providing to some of these to business people, for them to be able to create companies in an easier way, but also cost-free, right? Because in these cases, notary public, sometimes they charge a lot of money, but they still, in many of these countries, when you explain them all the advantages and also all the work that they still have in the, like with other company types, etc. So as of now, so we haven't received a lot of criticisms, at least in the countries that we have been working on. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, for that response. We've unfortunately run out of time. I think this is a discussion that could keep going for another couple hours. But I want to thank each of our presenters, Will, Judith, and Christian, for such great presentations. Will, again, thank you for that coverage of the paper that you and Simon authored, and for providing both examples that are relevant to directly leading to formalization, but also complementary efforts that can help populations that are negatively affected in crises in intermediary periods as well, that don't necessarily lead to formalization, but help those populations, such as workers. And Judith, thank you so much for the example from Cabo Verde, and Christian also for the example from Ecuador. I hope that we'll be able to continue these conversations on informality and formalization in the future. And I want to invite everyone to continue to engage with us. This is the link to the Business Environment Working Group's page. And please feel free to connect with us there. And we'll look forward to another webinar to continue these conversations soon. Special thanks, and wishing everyone a good rest of your day.